Hello. So I have been working on over the past maybe year and a half, thinking a lot about agency and thinking my way through several iterative models through which to conceive and think about agency, which I think are useful. And here is the current model I have been liking for agency. The way it's characterized is that there are five problems and five solutions to those problems. And I decided to use a pyramid because one of the problems and the solution is more important than the rest. All of these kind of tie together and overlap a lot in terms of what things they are concerned with, as we'll take a look at. But the main principle is that the place at which you can take action, or where all action comes from, is what you attend to, or what you choose to think about. And so the model is largely internal, and with the belief that actions are a consequence of what's going on internally. So a lot of this is predicated on the idea that you don't choose what comes to your attention, but when something comes to your attention, you can choose to continue to pay attention to it. So that's largely the blunt instrument that is used to develop all other tools in your bag that you use to develop one's own agency. So attention is the site of control, and you have to be careful at what things grab your attention. Especially today, we live in it has been characterized as the attention economy after the information economy, in that the thing that throttles people's ability to do things is no longer information. All the information in the world, if you have an internet access, is available, or not all the information, but a ton of information is available cheaply, and there's a huge glut of information. You just don't have enough attention to give all the information. So the real throttle on uh, interaction now is attention. So we went from industrial to information, and now we're in attention. So also, what you pay attention to colors your reality. If you took a geologist and a botanist to a waterfall in a rainforest, they would both have very different experiences of the same thing. The geologist, of course, thinking about erosion and sedimentation, and the botanist, the flora and the fauna. Um, so, what can we do to change the attention? If it's being pulled around and it's not within our control, a lot of the times, the only thing we can do is choose what we continue to pay attention to. And so, one of the things, the tools in the bag, is mental exercises. So, a lot of this model is informed by the idea that you're going to use mental exercises to try and help in these regards. And the second thing you can do is you can shape your environment. You can, by controlling what can enter your attention, you can largely, uh, that helps you give you better options for what you can continue to attend to. For example, if you're dieting, you don't put cookies on the shelf that's at eye level, you put them high up, or don't have cookies at all. And that way it's easier to resist temptation. There was a book called Thinfluence, which is largely written entirely about these sort of periphery dietary methods. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the other four problems, which a lot of them are somewhat intuitive and there's a lot of overlap. It's possible that in the future this model will shift, as the model has been shifting. The first thing is the unknown. If you don't know what type of action is appropriate, or even what the problem is, or what needs solving, um, you're at a loss. So uh, if you don't, you won't have any direction, and if you don't know what to move towards, it's hard to move in a way that's effective for producing good outcomes in terms of satisfying your values. So you have to know where you're going. So the tool for doing this is brainstorming, and there's a ton of different brainstorming exercises you can do. Uh, Importantly, is to clarify one's own values. That way, you know what you want to move towards, so you create direction. You also want to try and figure out what processes are going to be effective for getting you there. And you also want to try and think your way through things that aren't in your awareness, but if you start trudging down that path, they'll enter your awareness, and you can get distinctions from just procedural thinking, or if you want to think about it like this, you could get it from your subconscious. Second is, in my mind, the biggest enemy of agency is helplessness. This is the feeling that your problems are pervasive, permanent, and personal. So, pervasive in the sense that they occupy your entire attention, and so a little problem becomes like your whole world breaking apart, and it's like this because it occupies your entire attention. Permanent, that your problems won't change, or that you'll always have problems, and personal, that the problems are a consequence of you. There's a lot of learned helplessness studies. The one that's often cited is the one with the dogs, where I think I've explained this in earlier ones. They got a dog and they shocked it, or they got dogs and they shocked them. And eventually the dogs, and they made it so the dogs couldn't escape the enclosure, and eventually the dogs learned to just lay down and take the shocks. And then if they shocked them, but they could get out of the enclosure, the dogs that were already trained to be helpless did not get out, and the ones that weren't just jumped out. So the tool to use for the solution to helplessness is reframing. It is having an internal locus of control, and the two main things that reframing works at is changing how you view yourself and changing how you view your life story. And by self, that also includes your interaction with others, because identity is largely social. We care a lot about the stories we tell, or we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so, and this is a cognitive bias, but it's unclear whether or not one should try and reject the bias, or just ride it and utilize it to one's own benefit. There are a lot of NLP exercises for reframing that are pretty effective. I think the more proactive reframing is trying to shape one's own identity and stories that they tell themselves, but a more reactive reframing would be NLP. Also, cognitive therapy, which is demonstrably very effective, would be in reframing. Meditation would probably be somewhere in reframing and process orientation. Interestingly, there's a lot of overlap between being process-oriented, which we're going to talk about next, and reframing. So the Stoics, for example, their process was always reframing something to focus entirely, and again, it's coming back to attention, to focus entirely upon things within their control. And that was the paradigm of the Stoic, which has become popular now. There's a lot of good things with the Stoicism, and some like stuff that doesn't check out with psychology or empirical studies. Anyways, moving on. The fourth one is fear, which I think intuitively might be the most the first thing one would think of when thinking about what inhibits action. One way you could reframe fear, though, is that it's a signal, not necessarily a denial of action. There's performance anxiety is another aspect of this. If you're acting with a high degree of intentionality, there's this curve where as you care about something more, your performance goes up and up, and then there's a point, or not care, as your arousal level, as like how locked in you are, increases, your performance goes up and up, and then eventually it plateaus, and then it goes down and down because you experience performance anxiety. So how can we decrease this? Well, what you can do is you can focus not on outcomes, but instead focus on process. And also, you'll notice that this ties in pretty closely with reframing. But so you can prepare for future events. There's a lot of exercises, for example, the mental exercise of implementation intentions, where you say, if blank happens, then I will do blank. So, for example, if I am exiting my car, then I will take a piece of trash out of my car and throw it away. If you tell yourself this, there's several psychological reasons why you're going to be more motivated to do this. So, in that sense, we're being proactive, bringing back to attention proactivity, but we're preparing to execute something correctly. Although, that's not really, you're not afraid of taking stuff out of your car, but I would hope. Second is having principles, or reflexive ways of thinking about things. So you think about things ahead of time so that when you get to a stressful situation, you don't have to think about it then. This ties in with heuristics. If you have a way that you approach things, then you don't have to worry about handling it in real time if you're afraid. And then personal ecosystem, which is part of process but doesn't have as much to do with fear, but you're making your environment be one in which it's conducive towards putting things in your attention that are going to help you go move in the directions of actions you want. And a question I've started to like to ask myself is, what type of ecosystem am I willing to accept for myself? In which case you're tying it back with identity, and you're thinking, what am I willing to accept? For me, that's been pretty large in reevaluating the way I look at my environment, as well as the people I choose to associate with. And then habits, which self-explanatory. Okay, and the final pair is motivation and values. So, being undermotivated is obviously problematic for when it comes to action. There's an analogy that I've encountered in a couple books. It's kind of a ripoff of Plato in Plato's. I think it's either the Phaedo or the Phaedrus, or I forget which one of Plato's dialogues it is, but he talks about a charioteer and two horses, a horse that's immoral and reckless, and a horse that's virtuous, and the charioteer that's trying to keep them both on the path. So this is an early formulation of something of a subconscious that was later developed by Freud, where you have part of you that wants to stay on the straight and narrow, and the other part that's wild and immoral or what have you. Recently, that type of analogy has been reformulated in a rider and an elephant, where the rider is the thinking portion and the elephant, much stronger than a horse, is the emotional reactive thing. And so one of the problems is that the elephant, or the emotional aspect of an individual, is not under direct control, and so that makes motivating oneself hard. You get procrastination. And so what's the solution for this? A large part of it is going to be looking at your values, because you clarify why you're doing things, and you decide what you want to move towards, what you want to inspire you, and what you want to move away from, what makes you feel desperate. And if you notice, there's a lot of things that these pairs all kind of weave into each other, so the distinctions aren't necessarily clear. For example, being process-oriented can be effective for being motivated if you have like a heuristic or a procedure that you have to do. So for example, going to the gym can be hard sometimes, but if you have this thing where you tell yourself, I just drive to the gym, and if I don't want to work out, I don't work out, but I have to drive there, then that helps, and it's a process. So you're kind of weaving all these together. Anyways, I think this is an interesting and good way of thinking about agency currently, and it's how I structure my notes on it, and I hope this was useful.